Here's kind of a fun topic. It's a fun topic, and it's one of those imperative topics that I think that even when it comes to information in the Bible that isn't directly related to faith or the gospel or the ins and outs of our everyday walk, any little misunderstanding from the Bible that is held by tradition of men can be exploited by Satan for the purposes of distracting or detracting as many away from either having faith at all or being able to understand kind of the background activities that have gone on the earth since the beginning of time that have led us to the situation we're in right now. I made a series of videos reading off what my teacher has to say about this subject, but I figured now, since the channel is notably larger and the subject keeps coming up online in a few different places, and evolution is always an issue, right? Because science is always in our face trying to get us to believe a bunch of unprovable nonsense that is essentially the equivalent of a religion in the name of what they would call empirical facts that we can prove at hand, which we really technically can't even prove at all. But thankfully, the language that the Bible was originally written in and deeply studying it do show that there's a lot more going on than our modern understanding in the church would actually show. So I'm going to try my best to just rattle this off the top of my head. I will put links to this information so you guys can study it yourself, because I don't expect you to take my word for it. I would hope you're like the Bereans and you go out of your way to study deeply and honor God's word by filling up your mind and your heart with His truths. So Genesis 1, let's start. The common translations say, "In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth." And then it usually says "and" or "yet," most of the time "and." The earth came to be ruined and despoiled, with God's Spirit brooding over the surfaces of the deep. Essentially a picture of absolutely perfect, out of nothing, what's called ex nihilo in Latin, creation, where God miraculously makes matter because He just speaks it into existence because that's His will and He has a purpose for it. And we can assume by every indication of creation all throughout the Bible that it was complete, it was whole, it was an utter, interlaced, fully functioning ecological system with plants, animals, and so on, much like we see today, of course, minus free will having image of God bearing man. Now, there were creatures in the beginning of creation, or that were made towards the beginning of creation, that Job actually speaks about, the angels. The angels themselves, well, if we look into what Isaiah and Ezekiel have to say about Satan in his original status as the covering cherub, as it were, he was the one and only protector of the throne of God on the mountain of God in the original creation. He eventually, after he rebelled and did his thing, was replaced by a college of four that Ezekiel later sees, and a couple others describe in amazingly fascinating terms. But the reality is Satan existed sometime after the original creation, before the creation of man. And anyhow, back to Genesis 1 and 2. Essentially in the Bible you have two different terms for creation. You have, and forgive me, these are transliterations and I don't think I'm pronouncing them correctly, but I am Mexican and it's hard for me not to imply or infer some sort of accent. Bar-ah, B-A-R apostrophe A-H. This is the type of out of nothing creative act that when it refers to God, it's talking about His miraculous, instantaneous, utter, complete control of matter as a whole, because He's the source of all creation. And anytime it's used when referring to God, it's talking about a miraculous, instantaneous, ex nihilo, out of nothing creation. The other term that is used in the Bible is, and see if it's spelled correctly in the alliteration, it's an apostrophe, A-S-A-H, so asa, if you will. That particular verb describes creation, however, it is a refashioning type of creation. In other words, you take a skin from a cow, make a leather jacket out of it. You have created a jacket, but you refashioned it from something that already exists, right? Most people don't know this because they don't study the language deep enough, but Genesis 1 is bara. Genesis 2:4, when we see the beginning of the 7 days of what I have come to understand is refashioning or recreation of the original earth, uses asa. So it's basically describing two separate generations of the earth. One that was ancient, that likely had to do with Satan's rebellion and the falling of the third of angels that would eventually throw in their lot with him. And the other having to do with the initial creation of man, likely as a free will bearing potential replacement for him, hence his reasoning, Satan's, behind his attack on humanity and attempt to kill them off and stop God from ever reforming the full family of God that he had originally created with the entire contingency of free will bearing angels in the beginning. So if we look into verse 2, we also see some linguistic problems. First off, the word and or yet is a little bit misleading, because you have this perfect, out of nothing, complete, whole, utterly awesome and perfect creation originally, including the whole contingent of flora and fauna. And then in verse 2, you have a ruined and despoiled earth, essentially what is the picture of God's angry spirit brooding over the surfaces of what's called the Tehom, or the deep, literally describing the earth as essentially a giant ball of water. What this is pointing to, and I think the original readers of Genesis would agree, I don't know if it's easy for us to see because there's so many languages past that in our time, but to me, and I think to many who hold the what is coined the Genesis gap view, it shows that not only did the Lord likely kill off all the animals that were there that were likely polluted by Satan and his original activities, but it also shows that he flooded the earth before Noah's time. So the earth had been essentially completely inundated just the exact same way it did during Noah's time, only this time, because the lights were turned out and because we know what little we know about the atmosphere outside of Earth with no sun, everything immediately freezes. It was likely a giant ice ball, right? So we have some evidence, if you will, of what science calls an ice age. We have some evidence of what science calls a fossil record. The problem with the fossil record is, well, what does the Bible refer to Satan and his demons as? Dragons, or it refers to Satan specifically as a dragon, referring back to the snake that tried to trick Eve. But I don't think we are the first generation of people, our modern generation, to have found dinosaur bones. I also know that even though the Bible has some very awesome sounding characters and creatures, not characters, that lived during the time of the ancients, you know, the Leviathan and so on, none of those things are even remotely referred to as having any likeness to a dragon. Whereas we can look at dinosaur bones and clearly see that any depiction of a dragon is much more like a dinosaur bone or a giant lizard than anything described in the Old Testament as, you know, the behemoth and so on, Leviathan and so on. I think these were likely just as it's understood to be, you know, either a giant whale, giant alligator, giant elephant. We don't know, but we do know that they were intentionally not called a dragon for a reason, whereas Satan always was, and he was called a serpent and a viper and so on. And I don't think this is a mistake. Also, if we take the evidence from Genesis 6, the Nephilim incident, we see quite clearly that although we know the angels do not have bodies, we know that they have some sort of ability to manipulate the genetic code of man to such a degree that they were able to help foster a race of beings called the Nephilim that clearly had human spirits and had free will and all of that, but they were also called the men of renown, the giants, the heroes of old and so on, because they had a stature and a capacity that likely no modern human or human before or since has had. And it's part of the reason why they were so willfully able as a whole to reject God en masse, thus occasioning the flood of Noah's time, right? So it stands to reason that the primordial or prehistoric earth that our modern church, for whatever reason, doesn't understand existed, that is shown in Scripture, likely made for enough time for Satan to rebel. I personally think that when we see the tendency of demons in the New Testament to want to take bodies all the time, and their sycophantic obsession, almost addiction, like a drug addict, right? If they're cast out of a human body, they're asking to go into a herd of pigs and then running off of a cliff. So they're willing to take any amount of corporeal experience that they can get, being beings not of flesh but of spirit only. I think he used the seemingly unfair reality that they were spirit only and didn't have the ability to enjoy physicality and the corporal experience that animals and insects and eventually humans and maybe even hominids, maybe there were non-free will bearing so-called cavemen of that time. That perhaps we have bones for that. That doesn't mean it's actually provable or true. But it would make sense, and it would explain why there really is no incursions with dinosaurs throughout the Old Testament with any of the people on Earth throughout that time, and why he is called a dragon and referred to as such. I'm sure anybody who knew the Bible back then that would find any kind of giant lizard skull would automatically think Satan. Again, hearkening back to that original interaction between Eve and the snake. So. Yeah, why is this important? Well, evolution is one of those things that tempts a lot of science-minded believers that have been brought up in modern schooling that, for whatever reason, are tempted very strongly in this supposedly empirical proof world we live in that basically demands a physical proof of everything, otherwise people refuse to believe it. I think not understanding these basic facts of the very first verses in the entire Bible and their implications all throughout, not only doesn't allow for any time for the angels, which are free will beings, it doesn't allow for them to have any time to choose to rebel. It basically makes God into a giant controlling meanie that told the demons that they were to rebel and to be against him from the beginning. But we know, from the Lord's own words that he was a liar from the beginning. He brought sin into existence, period, by being the first to enact it. And that he's the father of lies and all these other things, and he couldn't have just miraculously, spontaneously, all of a sudden just decided to do it, right? Even when Adam and Eve sinned in their weakened state, still fully didn't grasp the totality of what they actually did until they were outside the garden, likely having to suffer. And angels don't have the ability to physically suffer like us, so for them to need eons and need millions of years, and perhaps they were on the earth playing Rock'em Sock'em Robots with a bunch of these mutated creatures that they had engendered by their genetic philandering. It all makes sense to me, and it would totally put the lie and a stamp of utter nonsense on evolution in the minds of those who can't accept that, well, the modern church doesn't have any explanation for these things. Now, that being said, the earth itself might be ancient, but the moon is 6,000 years old, the sun is 6,000 years old. Everything that we see in creation right now, including man, is only about 6,000 years old. That much is true. The earth itself, not so much. The angels, not at all. We also know, by the way, that the angels aren't just 6,000 years old, because in Job, once again, the holy angels were present and cheering when God created man. If there wasn't a rebellion, if there wasn't a reason to replace the lost angels in Satan and his hordes with sinful man, there would have been no reason to celebrate. There also, I think, wouldn't have been any expectation. The angels, I'm sure, had, even though they decided to remain faithful, they decided to remain faithful without any proof in their hands of the lies that Satan had told. So our creation is a proof to the angels that God is not only just, but utterly fair and completely loving beyond reason. So all of these things were being shown in our creation and the commencement of the 7,000 years of man, that God basically said, I'm going to refute you, all of your lies, and completely vindicate my character and utterly reform the family of God perfectly to a level that it was never at before. So let me know what you guys think. This stuff is controversial, but I don't think it's that difficult to understand. I'll put the links to this information in there, and you guys can study it for yourselves. The language does speak for itself, and it does point to all of these things being likely actual fact. And it is what it is. We trust the word, and we keep digging, and we keep going. So Thanks for watching. Like, share, comment, subscribe. Maybe send this to one of your friends who's addicted to evolution, and let him know that the Bible doesn't even back up the modern traditionalist nonsense stance that the church holds, and we should trust the Bible instead of tradition. Talk to you soon.